Hello and welcome to this edition of a Church Doctrine episode here. I am Mike Church, your host, and as usual at these long-form interviews, you never know what's actually going to happen. These are completely and totally unscripted. We do not script, and we don't go off with cue cards or teleprompters. Everything you're about to see and hear is live as it happens. Here on the Church Doctrine, my very, very special guest today is Jeb Smith. The book is Missing Monarchy. It's a great read, and hopefully it'll be in wide distribution by the time this video comes out, and you will be able to have access to it, and you can read it. I found the book because it was sent to me by the recommendation of a friend, Steve Cunningham. I want to thank Steve for that at Sensus Fidelium. And we have Jeb Smith here on the video hotline here, so we're going to go ahead and go and say hello to Jeb. Jeb Smith, welcome. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for having me on.
You're very,
thanks for reading the book.
Well, I think people should have great books like this to read, especially ones that are written in the modern era, because come to find out, and through your book I learned this, there's a lot of great work that was done. And there's a lot of great work that was done all throughout the 18th and 19th and early part of the 20th century. Not so much lately, but I think it's a genre that's making a comeback. I also want to tell our viewers and listeners that if you enjoy this interview, then you should get Brother Andre Marie's interview. It was an episode of Reconquest that he did a mere 3 weeks ago with Jeb Smith about Missing Monarchy. First of all, I have to ask, what's the title? Am I missing monarchy as if I'm throwing a dart and I missed it? Or do I miss monarchy as there's a burning hole that has been left in my heart?
Well, both of them apply. Definitely the latter. My hope is that if someone reads through the entirety of the book, they also will be missing monarchy as well and realize that there's a superior political system to what we have today. But also, the book as a whole corrects misconceptions about the Middle Ages and especially its political system. So it's also about Americans missing what actual history is. Almost any book you get, including modern scholars and professors at leading universities, you read the intro and it's almost guaranteed what Americans think is true about the Middle Ages is not true. And then they go attempt to correct those misconceptions throughout their book. And so I tried to do the same in my own way, focusing on the political systems especially.
Yeah, you think of the medieval age, and the thing that comes to mind, Jeb, is people that haven't bathed in their entire life. They're dirty, they're disheveled, they're miserable. It's always cloudy, the sun never shines, their teeth are rotten, they're scrounging around on the ground for grub worms and stuff to eat. And the kids all look very similar, and they're all running around barefoot, and some of them half naked. And then there's an evil lord that's running around on a horse that's gold-plated armor and what have you. And he shows up and he flogs them with a whip and with his lance, and then they turn over all the bread and what little coin they were able to acquire to him, and then he goes off to his castle and lives the life of luxury, and they go back to their life of squalor. But that's not how it was, is it?
Right. No, that's not it at all. In fact, we find modern life is full of work and drudgery and government regulations and control and taxation, that they lived a very free life compared to us today. They were in close-knit communities and families. They had festivals, they had plays, they had religious vacations all the time. They were consistently celebrating, dancing, music. The work was very leisurely. They definitely didn't have the material advances and comforts that we enjoy today, that largely due to technology, not the political system. But there's aspects of that medieval life that I think anyone would find charming and readily replace our hectic lives today with the medieval peasant.
And one of the things, the thing that kind of hooked me in and drew me into the book as I started reading it, and I guess this was never explained to me, and I am not a historical, I don't lack for historical knowledge, shall we say. I read a lot. But I had never read a work where someone actually explained the difference between a king and a monarch. And I'm reading your explanation of king, and it kind of dovetails with what I know about the medieval period. But your explanation of king is not the king of the movies. The king does not. As a matter of fact, it seems to me that the king has more of a struggle in life in the medieval period than the peasant or the serf or the landowner or leaseor on the manor in the English system.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the misconceptions Americans especially have. I've spoken with many people in Europe, and it seems less prominent over there. But definitely in America, we think of a king as a tyrant. Like even looking at King George, he put a 3% tax on tea that led to a rebellion. He was an absolutist monarch. And if you had conservative Republicans elected in every area of governance today, it'd be far more oppressive, and they have far more authority than King George had. And he had far more authority than a medieval king. And so, there's a huge difference between a king and a monarch. Basically, probably the most vital is that a monarch is above the people. He rules the geographical realm, so he is the ruler, and he can pass and create law to his advantage. They always had limitations. So at least in Christian countries, you never had an absolute monarch as we think of them. But a king is a servant of his people. And I go back to Deuteronomy and other passages where the king's not above his people, he's serving them, and he's below the law. And the law is owned by the people. He's simply a servant to them. He's not above them. He's a member of their kindred. And he can't create law. He's limited by it. And everyone, if he tries to go beyond that, everyone in society, from the church, the peasant, the vassals, everyone's going to object to him and push back. There's no obedience to him as there's expected to monarchs. That divine right of the king, that you're supposed to be obedient to whatever he does simply because he's a king. In the Middle Ages, it's like, no, there's just a human. He's supposed to be obeying the King of Kings who established law and order and liberty. And if he goes against that, he's now a tyrant. And he's supposed to be resisted if he tries to extend his power. So in a way, it's a very dangerous position for a king to be in. But as far as, I mean, he's obviously a large landowner. He has authority, and many people would want his position, I'm sure. But it's not our idea of a monarch ruler that most Americans have. And that's why I started with that section in the book, because I think that's the biggest falsehood, is that these kings had power. They're actually very libertarian, anarchist, really lacked control and power, and didn't influence 99.9% of the population, had no authority over them. They really only interacted with their direct vassals.
And I just want a quick quote from the book that I think will put most people in the correct frame of mind. Under medieval political philosophy, peasants did not have to worry about incoming rulers changing customs or infringing on their rights. The idea was to preserve and to protect. It's almost like what you see on the side of a police car, to protect and defend. How come we don't have a political class today that doesn't protect and defend us and our rights over the rights of people that are like moving into our country or our state?
Right, and that's why I deem the Middle Ages as truly conservative. I didn't know what conservative was until I ran into this medieval form of kingship, because there's no legislation, there's no way to change the law. Perfection is in the past. It comes from God, it comes from the Bible and people's customs. So a man, either a king or a majority in democracy, can't vote or violate God's law or what's eternal, what's already set in your law and customs from before you were even born. So you don't have to worry about who the ruler is, because he can't affect the law. The law is the true ruler in the Middle Ages, and that's conservative. It does not change. But in America, even under our Constitution, we allowed an amendment process and we have elections and politicians that can gather. And unless you have people representing you that are of the same mindset to maintain the Constitution and your liberty, which generally they aren't those kind of people, we're putting people who desire power in power, which is, to the Middle Ages, they'd be like, why are you doing that? That's the last person you want in power, is someone who wants it. But that's what we do in America. We thought we could have Christian gentlemen, statesmen representing their local areas, but that's just not what happens. It's the people who want to use government power to their advantage, often for interest and economic reasons, that don't care about the people, that fight hardest to get in that position. And that's why we're screwed up and why I love the Middle Ages.
Well, rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. This is a really good place to start here. You know, you think of the seal of the great state of Virginia, sic semper tyrannis, right? Which of course, laying on the ground is the dead king with the crown laying next to the victor's sword here, and it's almost like death to kings. And again, you're right. The American view of kingship is that all kings were bad; they were the worst people, and people suffered under them. But if you read Hidden Monarchy and other great works like it, but let's focus on Hidden Monarchy, or Missing Monarchy rather. If you read Missing Monarchy, the thing that is the takeaway here, especially in the early part of the book where you discuss the kings, is that kings had people under them as well. There was an actual system that was in place. You know, you had lords, you had barons, you had other men that kind of did the king's work, if you will, or dirty work, if you want to call it that. But the thing that's most fascinating to me is that kings, and you said this earlier, so I want just people to take this away. First takeaway, kings did not make law, correct?
Right. Yeah, that's the difference between a monarch and a king. A monarch, when Roman secular law returned during that 14th century mainly, amongst that was the ability to legislate. That emperors of old, the Roman emperors and pagan emperors as well, were considered somewhat divine or descendants of the divine. So therefore, they had the ability to pass and create law. And so obviously in Christendom, you don't have that. You have this is a man appointed, expected to follow God's law. The monarchs or the kings in the Old Testament weren't supposed to create their own law. They were supposed to obey and be under God's law. And that's what a king does. So that's the Christian viewpoint. He's not a law creator. But when that 14th century returns and Roman ideas and secular political philosophies is really what it is. The state is now somewhat divine, and it's taking on what Christendom used to give to the church, used to give to God as the highest authority, is now in modern society the government. And so rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God, is the whole mindset that the church and God and law is the highest. And if man or government goes against that, well, government's at fault because it's not the highest authority. And that's how it was in the Middle Ages.
Yeah, and you remind me as I'm reading your book, and as you're talking about the return of the Roman kind of canon, if you will, because the Romans had a Caesar, they had a Senate, and they basically had some form of a Congress or a People's House or a House of Commons here. A guy that wrote a book about this, and I don't know if you've ever read it, Jeb, but a really good book to read about this and about that Roman era is A Better Guide Than Reason by M.E. Bradford. And of course, the better guide than reason is, drum roll please, tradition. This is what we had in the medieval age. You had tradition. And the tradition, it was the king's job to uphold the tradition. And not only was it his job to uphold the tradition, everyone under him expected him to uphold and defend the tradition, correct?
Right, yeah, that's his main function, is to uphold and defend the law. And the people, of course, which is part of his job.
Now, you brought this up earlier. Most Americans think of the Boston Tea Party, and they think of this heinous, awful tax that it was probably 70, 80% of everything that they earned, and that's why they were throwing the tea in the harbor. 3D. The tax was the dreaded 3D tax. Think of a D as a penny. It was 3%. This is what caused a rebellion. Sales tax today in the parish that I live in is 8.75%. I lose 8.75% of every dollar that I use to purchase something, Jeb. I lose it. It goes to the state for whatever function. So how did a government function in the medieval age? Well, the short answer is, I'll give you the short answer, there was no government, not like we think of, so they didn't need to tax the people, correct?
Correct. Yeah, and I'd mentioned in early America, before the Civil War, the government functioned solely off tariffs. They made enough money off of tariffs because they were held to their functions under the Constitution. They hadn't progressed into what we do today. They didn't directly tax their people because the central government didn't need much money. They could get it off tariffs alone. And so, that's a great system. But yeah, in the Middle Ages, the king is reliant on his own lands for his own income. He doesn't spread this tax out among people and keep increasing his power of law. The more you extend government, the more money you need to support it, the more ways you will find to tax your people. And that's why I love the conservatism, the traditionalism of the Middle Ages. Like, no, this is what it is, and that's it. And that's why I mentioned in the book, it's more a judicial system, really. But I think my analogy is a wave where it rises up under certain circumstances, say an invasion. Well, now the king has certain functions where he's allowed to tax his vassals a certain amount to defend the realm. Once that invasion's gone, it fades away. It's gone. It's not like this permanent professional state and legislators that we're paying to meet above us and create laws. They don't have that. That's a completely different mindset because man is not the creator of law. The people are, and God from tradition.
And then in another subsection in the first part of the book about decentralization, most people don't even conceive of this. I'm with you and a lot of other people that you and I run in the same circles. I don't think the federal government should do practically anything. I think the enumerated powers in the Constitution is probably too many powers just in Article 1, Section 8. But if you could limit the federal government to it, that's a good place to start. And then start saying, well, do we really need the feds to do this? You can do this in the state. The way it ought to work, and we should talk more about this, and I think for about 2 years on this show, we talked a lot about it. And I'm glad you wrote this book, because it brought me back to the subject. What we should be talking about, what they had in the medieval age that we don't have today, is they had a devotion to a system of solidarity and subsidiarity. That's basically what you're talking about.
Right, yeah, and I think it's a natural, organic self-government. I mentioned choice is huge in the Middle Ages. The idea of forcing someone under a political system, even these enemies, the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons, if they conquered an area, they allowed them to keep their own law because it was just in the mindset. You're allowed the governance of your choice. I think it's a very Christian mindset, and diversity is allowed to happen. You don't try to gain more people on your side to outvote the other, to force them under your ways, which is what the founding fathers, and especially the South and the Confederacy, tried to do, was really strengthen the decentralization of the states and allow local rule. And then you don't have all this antagonism. That's why Thomas Aquinas said you want a united whole. And we did that in early America because you could have Anglicans in one state, you had the Puritans in another state, you had the Catholics in a state, and everyone kind of had their own culture. They all match each other. They had the same political system, and they could live as they want through decentralization. And the Middle Ages did that to an extreme extent, where even villages lived drastically different from the village next to them. They didn't, try to combine together centralized power and force conformity of one way on each other. They said, you live how you want to live. We're going to live how we've lived and how our ancestors lived. Now choose how you want to live. Go find the Lord you want. Go find the village you want. And I think that's a very biblical concept. Joshua tells the people, he said, you can go with the lords of the Amorites, the Canaanites, go back to Egypt. But as for me and my house, we'll serve the Lord. And I believe that's how governance is supposed to be set up, that you can make a good decision, you can make a bad decision. Choose your Lord and live the way you want to. That's your choice that God has given you. You'll face the consequences, but you have that choice, and that only comes through decentralization. The more you centralize, the more loss of government, the less happy everyone is, and that instigates all the fighting, the wars. Once democracy and centralization came about, wars escalate because now everyone's forcing their way on each other. Racism, all that kind of stuff originated, or at least really blew up when centralization, when you're forcing your way and everyone's at political war with each other, causes a lot of hatred. Why not allow everyone to live as they want? And decentralization in the Middle Ages achieved that to an extent even early America didn't have, but we had to a much greater extent than today, obviously.
If you read de Tocqueville thought we kind of had like medieval townships. He was absolutely stunned as he was traveling in the 1830s, preparing to write Democracy in America. I hate that he used the word democracy, but please, can we purge this word democracy? I can't stand it. So de Tocqueville is going village to village, and he's saying, well, in this village here, these people are Protestants. In this village here, these people are Catholics. In this village here, these people are Mennonites. In this village here, and he's amazed that they can all kind of get along by basically stay in your lane, bro, by staying in their lane, which is, I think, is the concept of America. I want to go back to something that Jeb brought up a minute ago, and you brought up the wars. And okay, so why ever was there taxation? Primarily to fund wars. Its primary purpose of taxation is to fund wars. Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution is very well thought out. They spent, I know because I'm a little bit of a historian, I wrote a couple of movies about this. They spent the most amount of time on Article 1, Section 8, and primarily on the Article 1 powers. Note that in Article 1, Section 8, you will have a navy, because if you're a country, a sovereignty, you had to have a navy. You can raise an army and pass taxes to support it, but no taxation for raising revenue for an army can last longer than 2 years. That's a medieval concept.
Right, absolutely. There are, if you get into Dixie, I have a chapter on, especially in the South, in the Confederacy, but a lot of the medieval aspects that came over into America. So I absolutely agree with you. There's a lot to love, a lot of similarities to find between early America and the Middle Ages. They didn't do it quite to the full extent, obviously. They were influenced by the Enlightenment and all that. But yeah, the Middle Ages didn't have that professional army. You didn't have a professional state or a professional army. And as I mentioned in the book, that came around in the 14th century when kings became more powerful. They taxed more, and then they kept these permanent armies in place, and you could keep armies in the field longer. And that's where you get into more of the modern totalitarian wars. Wars become far more devastating. We're in the Middle Ages, same as the Bible. God said you're supposed to have an armed militia, and it's based on the families, and they get called to war, like you said, like it's in the U.S. Constitution. They get called to war. They're not this permanent national army to be controlled by the government to fight around the world and do whatever their interests are. It's for the people and for their protection, and it avoids the permanent taxation to fund the war, as you're mentioning, when you don't have that army. Though it's more dangerous in our society today because it's so technologically advanced. You don't need the manpower, but I think investing in technology to be ahead is a way to ensure peace and not being invaded by, China or Russia or someone along those lines.
As Brother Andre Marie's mentor and my mentor as well in philosophy, Brother Francis said, in the 20th century, this is not a great accomplishment. In the 20th century, men invented industrial ways to murder other men through war and war machines. That's not an accomplishment.
Right. No, it's a horrible thing. And I said that's why we invested in weapons of mass destruction like the atomic bomb, because once democracy and the centralized state comes into play, the whole country is at war. That's why Germany bombed London, and London wanted to retaliate and bomb Berlin during World War II, because you're now at war with the entire country. It's workers who are producing tanks, producing missiles, producing weaponry. Where in the Middle Ages, there was a resistance to anything that was not man-to-man combat. If something's going to take out a bunch of people at once, well, that's considered somewhat immoral and unfair. And it's a different mindset. But I believe it derived from being at war with a whole entire nation. Now you need bombs, you need things to take out the whole country, to take out their industrial production. And that's why I prefer the more militia sort of armies that you had in the Middle Ages, where it's only the combatants that are at war and the rest of the country is free. And it's only oath-bound vassals. It's not this professional army that's tax-funded, and they go fight maybe for a couple of weeks or a couple of months, and it's over. There's very few casualties.
Right, and another thing you'll learn in Missing Monarchy, if you were a peasant or if you were a feudalist and you were on your farm and you were minding your own business, the king was not going to drive by with an army of dragoons and start beating you with the lash and conscript you into military service. Primarily because he needed you to stay there to make food for him, so when he returned, and secondarily, you probably stunk at fighting. They had men that were actually, that's what they did. The lords and the knight, and this is how knighthood comes about. But during the medieval times, though, folks, we can't conceive. Jeb's right. You can't conceive the concept of war and reconcile that with the modern concept of it, because the two are completely divorced from each other. There's no similarity. I don't want to spend too much time on war because I want to talk about feudal hierarchy. I think this is the thing that is most misunderstood about the medieval ages, the Middle Ages, whatever you wish to call them. It is conceived that, look, the most famous libertarian, or one of the most famous libertarians of the 20th century, wrote a book. Everybody says that if you're going to follow Ron and Rand Paul and the New Libertarian Movement and the Austrian Economist and what have you, and believe me, I did it for 10 years, you have to read The Road to Serfdom, because nobody wants to be a serf anymore. A serf is the lowest, most miserable, disgusting form of existence that man ever conceived of. Only it's not, is it, Jeb?
No, I would say it wasn't at all. And there was a wide variety depending on place and time what a serf was. But a serf, first off, where did he come from? He was a slave during Roman times. He was freed due to the tribal customs and feudalism and Christianity's influence from the pagan Roman times. So you had massive amount of slaves, and these poor people from the cities, as the government in Rome decayed, they were either going to die or starve or be slaves. And so feudalism elevated the serf. Even though he's technically the bottom rung of society, his life has improved. And we need to look at it that from that perspective. But the typical serf, he had no government control. He had no regulations other than his direct lord, who he would owe some usually agricultural produce, or he would have days service to his lord to help develop his lord's land, which I described many ways in which he could do that. He could have his son do it. He could hire someone else to do it. He could have his second son. And the amount of work that he did was far less than modern people. And he got to keep his own stuff. He was the ruler of his own land, even though it was technically the lord's often, and they were shared land. It was his land that he cared for, that he took care of. He didn't have a boss over him. His own production was his. If he wanted to develop and improve his life, he could. He owned business. He interacted with everyone as a completely free man, except for his lord, who he gained land. He gained the use of equipment from his lord, and so with that came certain obligations. But compared to today, I would say he's far more free than the American and lives a leisurely life. He's not this suffering. There's one quote of an actual slave, because England kept slavery longer than the rest of Christendom in a very small extent, but where he says, "Life is hard, I work all the time," something along those lines. And he's quoted all the time to describe entire serf's life. And the thing is, he was a slave. He wasn't even a serf. And so there's a wide variety, and scholars that have looked up the serf's life, it's far more leisurely than ours is today. They were free, incomparably free to us. What we face on our own property, supposedly free people and owning private property, we're regulated far more than a serf was.
And then another thing that you'll discover in reading Missing Monarchy about this feudal system here is that you drew it as a pyramid, kind of. But think of Heath Ledger and the movie A Knight's Tale. He's not a knight. He wants to be a knight. And ultimately, by the end of the film, in a joust with someone who actually is a knight whose life he saves, and he's given a hand up, and then the knight said, "This guy is more noble than any noble than I know," and he proclaims him a sir, basically, and then kind of elevates him up one level from where he is. It was possible in the medieval times. This is another misconception. Born a serf or born on feudal land did not mean that you were to die a serf or on feudal land, did it?
Right. No, there was actually two different labels that historians have given serfs. There's unfree serfs and free serfs. And generally what it was, you chose to inherit the land and the obligations tied to it. And this applied to every level of the feudal hierarchy. So if you're a serf And you know, let's say you had 3 boys, and you're going to pass on your land to one of your boys. Well, it's usually the firstborn that says, oh, I want this. This is our family. This is what we're doing. They're not forced into this. They're saying, I'll take it. I'll take the land and the obligations. I know this system. I'm happy with it. And so the land passes on. The next 2 sons may move to a town. They may go find another lord. They're not, you know, they're not slaves at all. They can move around as free peasants could, and they could elevate their status. As I mentioned, even serfs could own or have obligations due to them by other serfs or peasants. They could become a merchant. They could join the church. They could be appointed, as you said, even though it was rare. They could be become a manor lord themselves. They could become a knight. There was a lot of different ways in which they could elevate their status. They could become the pope if they wanted. And those things were rare, but the mindset at the same time was not this American mindset of inequality and I need to get to the top of this hierarchy. It was very contentment was throughout all of society. One historian said, if you're the shoemaker of the town, you're the lord and the prince of the shoemakers, and you take pride in that, and that's what your ancestors have done, and you're perfectly fine with being the shoemaker on the manor system. As I said, a lot of the peasants, all they did, they'd provide their service to the community. And that was their obligation. It was, you know, it was the job, is what they loved to do. They didn't own anything after that. No taxes, no regulations, nothing besides providing a service. And then they'd also sell their product, and they took pride in that. And there wasn't the, covetousness. You know, that was, especially during the Middle Ages, that was not viewed very fondly by the church, and people were more willing to accept their society and their position in society. But there were definitely ways to, if you weren't, to what we would call elevating their position.
But there's something else to this, and you'll read this in Missing Monarchy, and I thought this was just the most fascinating thing. This actually makes complete and total organic sense, as you point out. It makes organic sense. And that is this: just say you are the Lord. I am the Lord. You know, I always think of Monty Python. You don't vote for kings. Or say you're the Lord of the manor. There's not just one Lord in a kingdom, if you will. There's a lot of lords. Well, a lord may be over, let's just say he's over 10 families. There is a sense, first of all, the vassals and the serfs under the lord, the number one thing that the Lord prizes is loyalty. It's loyalty. And because he expects loyalty, well, then the head of each family expects loyalty in the children on down. There is this sense of pride that in this area where this Lord rules and these families here, look how nice that road is kept. Look how wonderful and bountiful the harvest is from that Lord. It was almost like they competed with each other, kind of for Lord-like bragging rights, to go to the king and say, well, my lordship is doing quite well, your majesty.
Right, and that's sort of the close-knit tribal community. Your lord is also part of that tribe of people, and you have that local pride. That's why local sports, to me, are really the only sports I watch, because you have that local pride. It's your community, it's your school, it's your town, and you feel this connectedness to it. And that's the same thing on the manor system. You live with these people. There's your community. It's not as though these serfs and peasants are like, oh, this is awful, I'm out of here. It's usually like, this is my family, this is who we are. I love these people, and I'm going to take pride in what we do, and we're a community. And to bring up the Civil War again, there's a couple observers that mention that on the plantation system, as you'll see in Dixie and in their local communities, that kind of the aristocratic planters throughout the South had the same, they connected it and mentioned how it was similar to the lords in the Middle Ages, that they were kind of the loved and looked up to. Like, so the peasants often looked to their lord as kind of an advisor, as a helper. He's generally more well educated, knowledgeable, and it's not there's not the antagonism. It's a group. He's a patriarch in a lot of ways.
And something else, if we're going to talk about the War of Northern Aggression here, which what the title of your book should be: "The War of Northern Aggression and the Dixie It Destroyed." If we're going to talk about the War of Northern Aggression and the system before, my friend Marshall DeRosa wrote, I think, the ultimate book on the South, and that is a look at the Confederate Constitution. He wrote it like his thesis paper in 1991. It's all about the Confederate Constitution, which they thought, Jeb, was an improvement on the federal Constitution, because they are, just like as you said, they prized their autonomy in their states. Again, I don't want to get you carried away with this, and I want to stay on the subject. Let's talk about the medieval person, average guy, average serf, or average someone who was working the land, even though he didn't technically own it, he basically did, and he could even pass it on to his sons, correct?
As long as they inherit it's kind of the obligations are tied to the land. And so they're somewhat owned by even a serf or a peasant, and he passes it on, but it's those obligations are attached to it. So and then they swear oaths to their lord, I accept this faith and the obligations, and he does the same, and it's a mutual bond, and it shows that it's two-sided. It's not one way. It's not the Lord forcing it. They're agreeing to this or coming to this agreement together.
Okay, my question though is this, and I've read this recently, and I read it on the Mike Church Show here on the air, and I'll just share with you who are watching this video. The average American today works somewhere on the order, I don't have the exact number in front of me, 1,800 hours a year, so somewhere in that range, somewhere up in there. During the medieval time, you probably think, yeah, but we got it made because there's an app for that, and we have technology, we have all this, we don't have to do all that grub and that slave work. Yes, you do. You do a lot more than you think. The average person, peasant, serf, whatever, in the medieval era, Middle Ages, worked far less than we do, correct?
Exactly, yeah. His vacation days were immense, and that was throughout all of Europe. So you had months and months off of no work at all. Like the church said, okay, you're not working, the local lord. You could have festivals, you could have jousting events, and people would just take the whole week off. It's not like this 9 to 5 industrial factory work where you have to go in, you have to be there every day so production happens. They worked at a leisurely rate. They worked less hours. One of the misconceptions from reading historians who have looked at the data is that when serfs or peasants owed a day of work to their lord, they assumed it was somewhat our 9 to 5, what you could do in a full day's work. And really, they allotted the land. They did these little plots of what was expected for a day's work. But a day's work back then was basically a half day's work, because they had the midday break where they'd have beer and lunch and all that. And so it was about 9 to 2 o'clock or 9 to 3 o'clock. And that was a day's work. And also they didn't have the boss over them, so you could go through it really quickly or not. But in the end, they worked far less hours than we do. It wasn't, they didn't have the modern capitalist society of creating, producing, earning money. It was more substance of survival, and life was centered around God, around the community, around family, and that's where their priority went. It was not into work and production.
One of the things that you'll also find stunning about that they didn't have to do that kind of work. They all were on farms. Either you were a butcher, baker, candlestick maker, or you were a farmer.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of them. You needed to feed society, and that's what the bulk of society was either peasants or serfs, and they were either self-sufficient farming for themselves, or they were farming for a lord. And yeah, we talk about the technological advancements and some of the farming equipment they've used. There's plenty of books out there saying, these are not actually saving time when you calculate all the money that you need to earn to pay for these, which is, time to earn that money, and all the repairs, everything like that. They use very different farming methods. And I don't know if you're familiar with Joel Salatin. He's a pretty popular organic libertarian farmer. And he was just appointed, I think, by RFK. I forget what position. Anyway, he writes on that a lot of how modern equipment and methods don't actually save time. And they were really implemented by Lincoln, by those agricultural schools. And what they've done in their purpose from the beginning was not to save people time to help farming, but it was to take the whole, like they did with the South, turn American agriculture into an industrial farm system, which started in the 1860s with industrialists who were allied with Lincoln's. They started the farming. They put the mindset of all this machinery and equipment. Where you go back to the Middle Ages, you go back to free-range farming, the way they did it, it was not as intense. It was very leisurely. And so even the farming was easier back then. They had to do less of it, and the work was more relaxed and natural.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, now that he did get Kennedy did appoint him to something, I need to get my interview with Joel Salatin from last November. I need to get it at the top of the YouTube page so everybody can watch it. What Jeb is describing is what's called regenerative farming, which we practice around here. And I can tell you that this idea that they tilled all these fields, that the slaves are out there in the 1820s and 30s and tilling up thousands of acres and having to go through it with their hands and pull all the weeds out and everything. That's not how it happened. They had a very tried and true system. They also didn't have fertilizers like we consider fertilizers, which, by the way, fertilizers, nitrates are the result of what? World War II. Leftover nitrates, got to do something with them. We'll call it fertilizer. Not to say it doesn't work, because it does. But in regenerative farming, you do a lot less labor, and because you use the land, you live with it. You don't live on it, you live from it. As Kevin Costner even said in an episode of Yellowstone, you grow stuff in the winter, you let it grow, and then when it dies in the spring, you plant right through it. You don't have to till it up. It's a lot less work, and you get a lot less weeds, and you get a lot better crops. That's a really good point about that. I want to move on here because I know you keep this interview with Jeb going on the book Missing Monarchy, as we've been talking about. So we already I think we covered warfare. So let's talk about knights. How does the knight come along? And I think this is one of the most fascinating. It still kind of inspires the imagination of people today. There are still women out there and young lasses and maidens that can conceive of knights in shining armor on white steeds and what have you here. But there's a reason why the knight, I think, endures. And I think, Jeb, it's because the knight spent his life in an imitation of Christ.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree. It was that servanthood, protector of the community. First off, he had to be a baptized Catholic, and he was a protector of the realm. And everyone likes the idea, I guess, or some women, of someone coming willing to fight for them, to face the danger head on. For his people, and the Lord is supposed to be that as well. The vast majority, or many lords, were knights themselves, and that was part of their duty, and they showed their loyalty and protection to the people. As if there's a threat, I'm the first one out there. I'm here to protect you in those dangerous moments. That's why I'm your Lord. That's why you love me. I love you. I'm your protector. And yeah, he's a servant of the people. He's willing to die for them, to sacrifice his own life for them, and I think that's very admirable. You asked how he came about. During all the Viking and invasions and things like that, kings could no longer protect their people, these weak, distant kings. So then you had the knights and the aristocrats rise up, especially on horseback, so they could quickly answer these raids that were coming from Vikings and that sort. And that's how they kind of gained power, as people migrated to these local lords and knights and lived under their protection in the manor system, and away from a king who could not protect them. And so you had various centuries where there was huge migrations to different knights and lords, because they said, this guy's a great lord. He's a great fighter. He has warriors under him. He's going to protect us. Whereas relying on some king who's going to show up late, we're all going to be dead. And that's kind of how knighthood started in many ways. And obviously, as the pagans converted to Christianity, the church played a huge role in instilling the values of what a knight is, as a servant and protector of his people.
And you can see this, Jeb, in early America, settled by French Catholics, and Spanish Catholics, the model is all the same. The deviance is with some of the English, but the model is all the same. The Spanish, especially, they come in. Let's use California as an example. You go up the coast of California, you'll find the mission cities. Every single one of them is the same. By the by, almost all the small towns that are still populated in Mexico, if they are towns and not left over from the Aztecs, pretty much follow the same model. Catholic Church in the middle, small town around it, farming community on the outside. And that's pretty much it, right?
Yeah, and I, from what I've found, I can't claim to have read extensively on it, but it seems like tribal life, when left alone by central powers, left alone by politicians and this government force, generally form that sort of community. They had the center is the religion, whatever religion it is, and then you have the local community that lives in this small, close-knit, similar-minded agrarian sort of society that's very libertarian, that's very free, and they live by their values. It's when people are manipulated from afar, often for economic or political reasons, that we see more modern society developing.
Let's talk about further on in the book. Let's talk about the Catholic Church. Under the subheading, the Church, I'll just read this for you. It will be hard for other ages to realize the part that is played by the Church in the feudal centuries. Just think about that. It'll be hard for others to realize the part that is played by the Church in the feudal centuries. The clergy are far more spiritual guides. They are directors of education and maintain about all there is of intellectual life, science, and learning. They help the weak secular authorities to preserve law and order. They supply practically all the teachers, lawyers, and professional non-feudal judges in Christendom, and very many of the physicians. So the church the church was not an ancillary part of feudal and medieval life. It was the center. Life was built around the fact that you were a Catholic and that the church was there for you.
Yeah, the church was like you said, in the little village, the church was the center of the village. That's often where people gathered. That's where baptism, marriages, that's where people gathered. And there wasn't the separation of church and state as we have today. People, when they left church, they didn't stop being church. The church was brought, okay, I learned this at church. This is how politics is supposed to go. This is how education is supposed to be. This is how family is supposed to be. And it was brought out and lived out throughout the community. And again, it goes back to that rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. If the authority is God, he's the authority, that's how you're supposed to structure society. That's why heretics were not allowed the freedom that Catholics were allowed, because the highest authority is not free speech. The highest authority is implementing Christendom from God. And so if the church is the authority, it doesn't matter what section of your life you're talking about. You come from that Christian perspective that's the authority that's to be implemented. So it's pervades everything in life. All the thinking, everything that they do kind of is a step down from that. It derives from that. You don't have like like today we take a class on economics and we learn about economics. We learn about money, stock markets, whatever it is, taxation, and we think economically in that class. They didn't do that. They thought what I'd call biblically, that's first. What does the Bible say about money? Okay, that's our economical system. That's what we're going to implement. And it just, it was everywhere. They didn't have, I think, the doubt that we have. They were sure in their faith, and they lived it out, and most important aspect of their lives.
Yeah, and then further on in the book, we get under the subtitle evangelism, and I've actually shared this part on air, about how everyone was an evangelist. There weren't people that weren't evangelists. Everyone was expected to evangelize, but you kind of evangelized by just leading the Christian Catholic life that you were brought up under, right?
Yeah, exactly. Everyone had their role in that, of course, but I would say even society as a whole, the way it was structured, was a form of evangelism, because everything was directed and pointed upwards towards God, saying, okay, he's the authority of our town. of our society, whatever it may be, of our politics, everything is under him. And that is a form of evangelism that they had in the Middle Ages that worked extremely well that we miss today. And that's why in a secular society, Christian seems like an ism. It seems off. It's abnormal. It's not natural. Whereas if you grow up in a devout Catholic society like the Middle Ages, it's natural to join into that because that's authority, and you just you follow along, and everything's natural. So it's a form of evangelism to structure a Christendom society.
Let's talk about your unfavorite word and my most unfavorite word, democracy. Because there's a chapter toward the middle of the book, Transition and Exposition. People may want to know, well, what happened? How did this occur? Well, how did it occur? The Romans basically got a second chance, and through a series of heresies, or heretics rather, who were the men that were supposedly philosophers like Hobbes and others, the idea came back that Christian civilization was holding people back, and what we needed was a return to the age of the Romans, and we needed to bring great councils back and senates, and then ultimately lower chambers like the House of Commons in England. You would have the Congress in the United States, and the farther this process goes along, the more detached government becomes from the people. You know, I've quoted this a couple thousand times in my 34 years of being on the air, Jeb. And that is Thomas Jefferson famously wrote a letter to his buddy Philip Mazzei in France. Jefferson was in Monticello and Mazzei was back in France. And he said, I don't think this system will work above in a civilization above the size of a New England township. So, I mean, even early on after the founding, there were still, John Adams is looking at it going like, ruh-roh, Raggy, I don't think this is going to turn out the way we thought it was going to turn out. Right. They knew that centralization was anathema, yet we seem to be stuck with it today.
Right, yeah, that's why Thomas Jefferson said states' rights was the surest bulwark against authoritarian rule and the unraveling of the Constitution and local rule. But I agree 100%. You can't force a bunch of people that disagree so adamantly that want different systems under the same system. It's going to unravel. It's going to lead to control, authority, all that. You need decentralization like we had in the Middle Ages. In America, I'd say it happened during the Civil Wars, where everything went downhill. After that, we managed well enough, for sure. We had a lot of checks and balances. We had a devout Christian population, but inevitably, I think you fail when you put man in charge. And Christendom did not do that. They had God in charge as the lawmaker, as the only lawmaker. And once you put man in there, the wrong people are going to seek it, and they're going to control other people.
I'm going to quote you. Democracy is one big war of people denying each other self-rule. Amen, brother. That's exactly what's right. I hate the word. We have a democracy. You might have one. I don't have one, and I don't want one. All right, we're going to wrap up here with Jeb Smith. We're going to cut to the end of the medieval part where you say, you talk about partisan hacks and about modern politics. This stuff is inconceivable to the medieval peasant, lord, baron, or king, isn't it? He could not conceive that this was ever possible to happen. So what do we do about it?
How do we fix it? Are you asking? That I'm working on an article right now of actually two of them that should be out in the next few weeks. But I think decentralization is the key. I go about how I think we could implement that in America. But the problem is you need those in power to agree with it. And that's a very difficult thing when they benefit from the system that's in power. You really need to do it at a local level, town, county, and state at the most, and really get a lot of people to buy into it, to try it, and see if it doesn't get squashed out by the national government. But I will be publishing a couple articles on that, and I definitely send them to you, but it's got to be done locally, and we have to allow self-rule at the local level. And it's a difficult thing for sure.
Even then, if they're not Christians, then it's self-rule that's lacking. I'll just leave the audience with this philosophy. You quote this guy, Eric von Knelt-Ledeen, I believe is how you pronounce it. Knelt-Ledeen?
I believe so, yeah.
Knelt-Ledeen says this, quote, "The true Christian as a candidate in a thoroughly democratic state is almost unthinkable. Unthinkable. Only in rare cases will he succeed in maintaining his position. The Christian candidate would be sincere, frank, and serious. He would confess ignorance where need be. He would oppose his constituents when his conscience advocated disagreement. He would refuse to distort facts by popularizing them or by boiling them down to a deceptive simplicity, think bumper stickers and slogans, thus flattering the intellectual vanity of the credulous masses. The bad pagan simply lies to his voters." Folks, the bad pagan simply lies to his voters. True story, happens every day. He continues, "He pretends to understand problems he is not acquainted with and simulates knowledge. He is determined not to stick to his promises or even act against his conscience. The good pagan is in the worst situation of all. He lies, quite subconsciously, to himself. He believes, perhaps in all sincerity, that one can square the circle. The good Christian's position is almost a hopeless one, since he is not willing to sacrifice ethical values to the Moloch of popularity." Amen, brother, and that's a great place to, I think, end the conversation. There are a lot of Molochs of popularity out there. You know, I call it the MSM. I don't call it mainstream media. I call it the Molochian satanic media, because that's what it is. It's Molochian, it's satanic, and it just happens to be media. And there are currently millions of people out there. Some of you out there right now. Currently millions of you out there that don't really care about your fellow man. You know, I think that one thing we could, after you watch this interview, and you should read the book Missing Monarchy, I think one thing that will be the takeaway: medieval life, the Middle Ages, before the magic of the Enlightenment, which should be called the darkening. Medieval life was easier. It was more filled with leisure. There were more children. Babies make families. Children make people happy. Most people want to see a baby smile. There was bountiful produce. There were animals everywhere. You didn't want for anything. You didn't have to go out and work 70 hours a week in 2 jobs. It was just simpler and easier. Can we LARP? Can we live action role play and go back to it? I don't think that that's the position I'm advocating, or he is. I think that what we're saying here, though, is we can take these guys here, we can take this phone here, and we can take our electricity, which Jeb and I are using to communicate, and we can use them as tools for a better life. But they aren't the definition of life. There's an app for that. It is, I think, an adage that needs to go the way of that wolf that was extinct and these morons just brought back into existence. Jeb, your final thoughts on the future, and give people a 30-second sales pitch on why they should read Missing Monarchy.
I believe you should read Missing Monarchy because you probably have a misunderstanding of what the Middle Ages were like and what life was like during that time. It was very important. And as you mentioned, the Dark Ages are really the Enlightenment, and what's portrayed in our society as great is really sort of the beginning of the decline of self-rule, of politics, of culture as a whole. And monarchy will give you a perspective and an understanding of that we had something in the past that's far superior in many ways. It doesn't mean you have to accept everything, but to our own, and it will help you to think outside the box and question our progress as a whole. Has what we call progress been good for society or not? And you have to diagnose the problem before you can do anything about it. So this book attempts to show you where the problem lies and a solution, how to get back to it.
Jeb Smith, want to thank you for your time. We're going to do another interview with this gentleman because I can't wait to read Dixie and talk to him about Dixie. Until then, so thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
All right, hang on just a second here. Folks, this wraps up another episode of The Church Doctrine. If you like what you saw in this episode, share the video. You are the advertising agency. Without you, No one else is going to see this. So hit that like button, give us the share button, and share it with your friends and family. There's about 13 other episodes of the Church Doctrine, including an interview with Brother Andre Marie on some of these subjects. Check them out right here on the YouTube channel or on my website at crusadechannel.com. As I always say at the end of every show, and I mean this sincerely to all of you, God bless you and Mary keep you.